Thank you very much. So I think Professor Sachs already arrived, so I will invite him to join us in the scenario. Jeff? Hello. So would you like to join us here? Okay. Okay, so I will leave the word to our next speaker, who is Professor John Dernbach.
Good morning, everybody. I've been in this position before, the last speaker on the last panel. And so I appreciate your attention and your willingness to still be here. I'm going to focus today on something that's a little different than what we've been talking about. We've been spending a lot of time talking about engineering. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about law. And what I would invite you to do is think about the relationship between engineering and law. Now, let's see if I can make this. There we go. So, my presentation today is based on a book that I edited with Professor Michael Gerard at Columbia University Law School in New York. The book is called Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. And it's based on the work of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, of which you've heard some already in the last day and a half. It's the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and another non-governmental organization put together 16 reports around the world asking the question for 16 different countries representing 3/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, what can we do to limit warming to 2 degrees C? And for developing countries, the question is what kinds of laws, what do we need to do by way of law, technology and policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050? Now, what Professor Gerard and I decided we needed to do was take that project one step further and ask not just what policies are necessary, not just what technologies are necessary, but what laws are necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by that amount. We put together a book that is quite long. It's about 1,000 pages long, and I have summaries with me that I can show you. But we did a deep cut in a very deep dive across pretty much every single aspect of the climate change puzzle you can think of in the United States, and brought in about 60 distinguished professors and practicing lawyers to do the job. Now, one of the things that we saw when we did this project is that there are some broad pathways to deep decarbonization that are worth thinking about and are worth paying attention to. And part of the problem I think I see often in conversations about climate change is we tend to step into the thing that most interests us. Well, electricity. Well, cars. Well, energy efficiency. Well, carbon capture. And the challenge you have is you can't get the kind of reductions you need unless you look across all 5 of these pathways. For the United States, for example, what we need to do is improve the energy efficiency with which we use energy by a factor of about 2 between now and 2050. We need to take pretty much the entire electricity sector and move it over to renewables or nuclear or fossil fuels with carbon capture, which is incredibly expensive, and I get that, but pretty much we need to decarbonize the electricity sector. We need to move pretty much all liquid fuels, oil and gasoline in particular, either over to renewable electricity or renewable biofuels. The evidence indicates that we need to probably not just get to 0, but to get to negative emissions. And so we need to work really, really hard on technologies that are not yet available to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and to capture it. And finally, this doesn't get as much attention as it should, we need to significantly reduce non-carbon dioxide pollutants. And I will tell you that from an international point of view, the most successful effort to date to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the world, right, is the Montreal Protocol and the various agreements that have come out of reducing the pollutants that adversely affect the ozone layer. Why? Because those same pollutants are also greenhouse gas pollutants. So one other aspect of this, I'm showing you this for the United States, but I think there are analogs for other countries, is we need to work at all different levels of governance. Now, federal, state, and local law in the United States are pretty commonly discussed, but it's also worth talking about, in a fairly direct way, private law. You've heard a lot of conversations over the last day and a half about the importance of involving the private sector. Well, every time the ABC Corporation decides that it's going to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by ensuring that its suppliers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, the ABC Corporation does that through contracts. There are all manner of legal agreements and laws that are necessary to make deep decarbonization work, even at the level of the private sector. And the private sector is, of course, on its own terms, already responsible for significant emissions of greenhouse gases. So what did our book conclude? Well, when we got all done with the book, we took all of the recommendations and we put them in one place. We asked every single chapter author, by the way, to say, for any particular topic, what can you tell us about the potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from this topic? Can you tell us what laws are already available on this topic? And can you tell us what recommendations you have for federal, state, local, and private governance? And we came up with about 1,500 recommendations. There are actually that many different choices that exist in the United States to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, and as prior speakers have indicated, it is highly, highly likely that the reducing these greenhouse gas pollutants is going to have other impacts that are also positive, environmental, social, security, and so forth. And I think that's a good news story. Now, we're not asserting that there's only one way to do this. There are actually a bunch of different ways to do this. There are 4 different scenarios in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project. One is a high renewables scenario, which of course I think probably folks can think about and many in the room probably would like. There's also a scenario that involves the high use of nuclear power, which could work if you could figure out how to make it cheaper. There's another option which involves very high use of carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture and use, which again could work if you could make it cheaper. And then there is a mixed scenario that involves some distribution of renewables and carbon capture and nuclear power. Now, we're not asserting that there's a particular approach that is best. What our purpose in developing the book is to show that there are a bunch of different ways, there are a lot of different ways in which this can be done. Now, one thing to think about here is that there are a lot of different kinds of legal tools. Now, I expect there aren't too many lawyers in the room. In fact, let me ask, are there any lawyers in the room at all? 1, 2, maybe? Okay, so here we are. Let me help you think about law a little bit. When you talk about different kinds of legal tools, what comes to mind for most of us is additional regulation, right? We need additional regulation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's one thing we need to do. Another kind of tool that we often talk about are market-based tools or market leveraging tools. Carbon pricing is one, cap and trade is another. And surely they have a role as well. But there are other kinds of tools, and they have a distinct and important relationship to engineering. And so let me walk you through this a little bit. A lot in US environmental law, a lot of additional regulation that occurs is regulation that is called technology forcing. So the lawmakers will ask, what particular goal do we want to achieve by a particular date? and they will establish an ambitious goal. And some people will say it can't be done, but often as not, the goal can be met. And the law that establishes a fairly significant goal for emissions reduction, for example, forces the development of new technology and actually has a positive role in that regard. Market-based tools can do the same thing. Market-based tools create competition and incentives for improving technologies so that those technologies will be cheaper and more and more impactful and more likely to actually get to the market. But a challenge that exists many times is that law gets in the way. We don't often think about the ways in which law gets in the way, but law gets in the way a lot. If you increase the price of carbon, for example, and the price of carbon is imposed on tenants in buildings, but landlords are the only people who can improve efficiency, put solar on the roof, or do other things to foster renewable energy, then the carbon price lands on people who cannot do anything about it. And over and over and over again, that becomes a problem with carbon pricing. So carbon pricing can't do everything by itself. Well, you'll see also, if you look at this list of tools, research and development will foster new technology. And many of these other tools will do the same. So law can play a really important role in fostering the development of new technologies, but only if the law is designed right. Only if it, and that's one way in which law is like engineering. You can't just throw a law at the problem, you have to design it with some care. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can put together combinations of laws in order to achieve particular goals. You can say, well, we want to achieve zero emissions by 2050, or we want to get to negative emissions. And I think goals are a really important way of bringing together people from a lot of different sectors to figure out how we can accomplish a particular result. And if you can bring together people from a variety of different sectors, you can accomplish some very interesting things. New York State just passed a law that sets a goal for greenhouse gas reductions and has a separate process for figuring out all of the different tools that would be needed to achieve those reductions. The UK has something similar to that. Now, a couple of things just to say about the relationship between law and governance. One, laws operate as building blocks. If you think about the legal tools in our book, there are 1,500 tools, and you can use that as you can use that to build all kinds of different approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Sequencing, as you heard from the Chilean Environment Minister yesterday, is incredibly important. Starting out with the things we know we can do, the things that we know are cost effective, the things that we know are going to create good co-benefits are really important. This whole process is something that has never been done before. There's no place where we can go and say, well, gee, we've decarbonized an economy before somewhere, so we know how to do this. And so we're going to have to tolerate a lot of learning by experience. I like to think about coordinated governance as making sure that all levels of government are saying and doing the same thing, and I have complementary policies. And in a perfect world, that's how it goes. But I will say this, that having different levels of governance is also important from a resilience point of view over a long period of time. When you have the kind of setback that we're experiencing in the United States right now at the federal level, you can see how the importance of private governance, corporations moving ahead on their own, state governments moving ahead on their own. And while as much as a lot of us would like a strong federal presence, having multiple levels of governance is something that is really good as a way of handling setbacks. So the one last thing I want to say, because I think there are a lot of engineers in the room, is that a lot of us have different roles in all of this, a lot of different things to do, and there's certainly plenty of work to do. And if you want a really interesting story about the role of engineers in all of this, I commend to you a book that was published a couple of years ago by Paul Kennedy called Engineers of Victory. And the subtitle is The Problem Solvers Who Turned the Tide in the Second World War. And it's about the people who designed the tanks, the planes, the amphibious landing craft, and all the various technological and management things that needed to be done in order to make the grand strategy of winning World War II happen. So, having said a few things about law and commended a book to you, I close. Thank you.